Hi everyone, my name is Barbara Howe and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of South Florida in politics and international affairs. And my area of study is propaganda. I'm teaching a course this semester. It's a special topics political theory course called POT 4936, Democracy and Propaganda. So I have many other videos on my YouTube channel that talk about specific texts that we read in this class. But in this video, I'm going to talk more broadly about the subject of democracy and propaganda. Now I'm recording this approximately a week after the 2024 election. Donald Trump has just been elected to the US presidency for the second time. And it's causing me and a lot of other people to think back on where we were when this happened the first time in 2016. And I've got to say that in 2016, the election of somebody like Donald Trump to the highest office in the land completely threw me for a loop. I really did not understand it. And so I'm an intellectual, and so I do what any intellectual would do at that time, which is to, whenever you encounter something that you don't understand, which is just to go about studying it very methodically, deliberately, thoroughly, with as open a mind as possible. Meaning, in this case, your true goal is to understand something, then you have to throw out any kind of political agenda. I wasn't interested, I was doing this for my own personal fulfillment and benefit, so I wasn't interested in proving any kind of political point or anything like that. I just really wanted to understand what was happening in my country in 2016. So I went back to school and eventually started a PhD program, which I am now finishing. I'm on the job market and I'm going to be defending my dissertation in the spring. So I'm either going to continue teaching in academia or I'm going to return to nonprofit or government sector where I hopefully will get to be able to write reports and continue doing research on my areas of specialty, which are now democracy and propaganda. So in this video, I want to talk a little bit about that concept of propaganda for a more general audience. And the students in my class, we've been thinking about this question for almost I guess we're on week 12, 13, about 12 weeks now, exploring about what the concept of propaganda is exactly. Is it rhetoric with a political agenda? Yes. Trying to get you to believe something that may or may not be true. Yes. Some of the authors that we read have argued this is exactly what propaganda is, and I would agree with such a definition. Or should we say that propaganda is like persuasive talking points that sound good but ultimately mean nothing? And I'd say yes to that definition as well. That definition sort of encapsulates how Plato and Socrates thought of course, they didn't talk about propaganda, they just called it political rhetoric. So, by the way, for the record, I probably should have said this earlier. Political rhetoric is just another word for propaganda. Rhetoric, of course, means language, and political means that it's language that is used for a political purpose. Okay, so it has a particular aim or goal in mind that it hopes to motivate listeners to be receptive to. So anytime language is used to achieve a political goal, that's called political rhetoric, and we could also call it propaganda. I think that is completely a correct thing to say, that it is propaganda. Jason Stanley's definition of propaganda as false ideology. There's been this political theorist by the name of Jason Stanley who has this concept of propaganda as false ideology. I won't go into that too much here because I have another video tutorial that goes into that in great depth. For now, I'll just say that Stanley's idea of propaganda as false ideology is particularly useful for understanding how propaganda works in democracies. And that means it's particularly useful for us to understand how propaganda is working in the United States right now. Propaganda as false ideology is the idea that a political ideal such as of liberty, democracy, justice, the language of that ideal can be employed to undermine that ideal itself. So, using the language of liberty and freedom to actually reduce liberties and freedoms for the population. That's an example of false ideology. So, this has been, I think, the most useful explanation of what propaganda is to explain the so-called post-truth or post-factual era that we're living in right now. And so propaganda is simply language that is used to achieve a political goal. That's as opposed to language that is used to achieve understanding, especially understandings of truth. Okay? Is propaganda the same as lying? In this class, we've also talked about whether propaganda is lies and learned that it doesn't have to be lies. Sometimes it can be true statements. It also doesn't have to be delivered insincerely with an intent to manipulate. Sometimes, in fact, many times in a liberal democracy, this is how propaganda works, is that it is completely sincerely believed by those who are repeating it. Meaning that they are true believers. They are not intending to deceive you, but nonetheless, that is still propaganda. As an example of this, think about Hitler's rhetoric during World War II. He sincerely believed that Jewish people were, in his words, something like maggots on the flesh of humanity. That was his sincere belief, like not literally, but he felt like that was an apt metaphor to describe people of the Jewish faith. Okay, so of course we want our definition of propaganda to include something like that. Imagine if we were to say, no, that wasn't propaganda because Hitler sincerely believed those beliefs, therefore we wouldn't call it propaganda. That would be crazy, right? So we definitely want to have in our definition of propaganda the belief that, it can sometimes be sincerely believed by the speaker who is stating those beliefs. So, are we living in a post-truth era? Let me say that term post-truth first came into popular usage in the aftermath of the first Trump election in 2016. Of course, many people were profoundly disturbed by how little factual truth seemed to matter in politics. Trump could tell lie after lie, even about demonstrably untrue things, such as the size of the crowd at his inauguration, and this didn't seem to lose him any political supporters. Why was that? Why would people not care about the truth? If you think about it objectively, of course, don't you want your politics in order, to have the best life, in order to have a functioning political system, don't you want it to be based on truth rather than lies? So that's the concept, the post-truth era, is that people no longer seem to believe that is the case. Maybe it's fine that we could go for a political candidate to lead the most powerful country on the earth who seems to believe in lies, or to seem to believe that truth doesn't matter anymore. And so those of us who believed that it still mattered were accused of living in the reality-based community, right? And various political strategists explained that actual facts don't matter in politics as much as perceptions of those facts, right? Newt Gingrich said this at one point too, in an interview. I think it was on CNN, but he said that it doesn't matter, whether crime is actually up or not. In that time, it was not actually up. That doesn't matter so much as if people believe that the crime rate is actually up. So it's what people believe that controls how they vote, right? So even though the crime rate is actually down, and it continues to be down from previous levels, if people feel like, or they have this emotional feeling that, I think the world is dangerous, I feel like crime is up, Gingrich was saying that that's what matters in terms of, how people vote. And in a sense, he's right, but in a bigger normative sense, should that really be the case? Should that really be how we want to form our politics? Is that a wise basis for political action? So that's the whole motivation. My motivation in going back to school and studying this problem, my motivation in designing this class on democracy and propaganda is to understand, how did we get here? And so, of course, I need to say, like, as we've heard before, that this is not a new thing. Of course, academics have been explaining that the role of truth in politics has long been a contentious one. And this is not the first time, of course, that we have lived in such an era. And so that term, post-truth era, or the post-factual era, like the article that my class is going to read this week, it's kind of misleading because it suggests that once there was a time when we based politics on objective facts and there was none of this, and that is not true, right? Facts always have to be interpreted. Now, what does that mean? This next section will explain. Now, to return to that question of how did we get here, of course, there are many, many different things going on. We have a confluence of different phenomena going on right now that has brought us to where we are today. Some of it is economic shifts, lingering effects of the 2008 recession. A lot of it is psychological. Previously privileged, as our culture and our politics becomes more accepting and embracing of multiculturalism, and a rejection of white supremacy, we have previously privileged groups who are losing unearned advantages that they used to enjoy for decades or even centuries even, and are feeling resentful of having to play on an increasingly even playing field, right? So that's some of what is happening. When people feel like they're losing privileges that they used to enjoy just as a given, then that's going to lead to, kinds of political backlash, right? As other people gain rights, some people feel like that they themselves are losing rights. So there's a lot of psychological factors playing into the current political situation right now. And then, of course, like a big chunk of it is the influence of technology and social media. Some of it also is the influence of corrupt things that happened in the past that caused people to lose faith in our current institutions, right? So anytime there has been the revelation that our current institutions are not perfect and they have made mistakes, that contributes to an overall erosion of public trust in those institutions. And so people become more open and receptive to the idea that that those institutions are biased and not to be trusted. So all of those things are coming into this this current political situation. The way I want to start out getting there is by talking in this video about the concept of truth. And there is this false idea out there now that there is no objective truth, that all truths are subjective and relative, and that therefore means that yes, you can have what Kellyanne Conway called alternative facts. And that's led to this idea that, well, it's my right to believe in alternative facts if that's what I feel like is true. And also that my opinion that is based on these alternative facts, that's just as valid as opinions that are based on actual facts. That's the insidious lie that I want to address in this video. So that's another way of describing the post-truth era. That's the description of the post-truth era that we're trying to figure out how we got there, right? Okay, so some people became convinced back in 2015, 2016 that this is something that they learned in their college classes when their professors tried to teach them about postmodernism, right? So, Ms. Howe, can you explain this postmodernism? What does that term mean? And, is this current situation, what I just described, a postmodern view? Is this what politics is like in the postmodern era? First, let's talk about that term, postmodernism. What does it mean? So first, I'll say that postmodernism is a terrible term for something that is so broad and undefined. I no longer use it. I think most academics probably no longer use it because it's become a sort of boogeyman that's meant to scare people, right? So we use other more precise terms now to describe specific things, and I'm not going to go into those things right now, but like one of those terms is post-structuralism. That's a very specific idea about how meaning gets created. The reason I say that the term postmodernism has become like a boogeyman to scare people, it should scare you if you've understood it in the way that I just described, that, I can form my opinion based on alternative facts because that's what I feel like is true, and that's just as valid as your opinion, which is based on actual facts. So I want to be clear that this way, saying that is postmodernism, is a perverse twisting of the concept for political purposes. In other words, it itself is propaganda, okay? So that is not what postmodernism means. That is what people who have a political agenda want you to think that postmodernism is. Meanwhile, academics have largely abandoned the term, so the concept is just left out there floating to mean what the alt-right wants it to mean. So we've kind of ceded that concept to them, which is kind of a shame, but also it's generally, it's not a great term in the first place. So I think that's why academics haven't really fought for it. But it's just a shame because it is out there misleading a lot of people into thinking that the academic left, by describing postmodernism as the idea that there is no objective truth, that they are somehow responsible for the current situation that we find ourselves in today. And that is not the case. Let me go back to explain why. Let me go back and talk about our concepts of truth. Politics has always had kind of a contentious relationship with the truth, and a really great article explaining this is Hannah Arendt's 1967 article called Truth in Politics, in which she addresses just this question. Doesn't it seem like political power always has the power to triumph over truth? When we're and this sounds familiar to many of us when we're in our most cynical moods. We would want to agree with that. I certainly do. When I'm in my most cynical mood, is that, yeah, it does seem like, whoever has the most political power, they're the ones who get to define what is true or not. But Hannah Arendt's article is actually, I think, it is hands down, by far, the most optimistic academic text that I have found to include in this class, because she ultimately shows us why that is not the case. And so I hope to do something similar in this video, is to show you why, no, that's actually not the case. The reason is, she says, is that because there are different kinds of truth. The number one thing I hope people will understand and take away from this video is the idea that there's not like one single kind of truth. There are multiple kinds of truths. There are rational truths, which include mathematical truths, such as 2 + 2 = 4, stuff like that. Then there's factual truths, and I'll say more about those in a minute. And then there are philosophical and or moral truths, which you can group those in the same category, or you can separate them out into different categories. But I think, when you think about it that way, then it starts to make sense. Okay, yeah. If you spend any time at all thinking about what truth is, then probably you have to admit that, okay, it is not one single thing. There are different kinds of truths, right? There's rational truths, mathematical truths, factual truths, philosophical truths, and moral truths. Not all of those truths work in the same way. So what Arendt says, she explains, and I'm not going to summarize all of her argument here because, once again, I have a video tutorial that's specifically on her argument as a separate video. So you can check that out, where she explains all about the different kinds of truths and how they differ from one another in their, what she calls their mode of asserting validity. That is how we know that they are true. It's different for a rational truth or a mathematical truth, how we know that that is true is different from how we know that a factual truth is true, for example. Okay? So like we know that a rational truth is true. It has an external source of validity, meaning 2 plus 2 is 4. We know that is true, not because of anything in us or in human society, but because of a logic that sort of exists outside of us, outside of the human community, outside of the political realm, which represents the social community that humans live in, right? There is no society where you can go to where 2 plus 2 equals 5 and that's considered like a valid thing, right? That wouldn't make any sense. So that's what she's talking about with like rational truths. They exist in this realm outside of the political world. They literally are universal. So this is what some people have forgotten or misunderstood when they get to this idea of postmodernism that says all truth is, there is no objective truth. People are not remembering that rational truths, such as 2 plus 2 equals 4, are indeed objective truths that do indeed exist outside of any context. They're always going to be true no matter what cultural or historical context you're living in. 2 plus 2 equals 4 is as true today as it was in the 16th century, as it was 500 years before the birth of Christ. It's universal in that respect. It's culturally non-specific, right? So there are truths that are objective. If you think about rational, mathematical truths, those truths are objective and they're not subject to politics. They are not culturally relative. They are not culturally specific in any way whatsoever. So we know right away that that statement, there is no objective truth, we know that that's a false statement because it needs to be clarified. Nobody would say that rational truths or mathematical truths are not objective, right? Or at least no serious academic that I know of, or at least I have not read anything that I would take seriously that would argue such a point. Okay, once you start arguing that rational truths are culturally subjective, then I think really we do start to lose the ground beneath our feet. Let me go back to Hannah Arendt. What's so hopeful about her article is that she says that factual truths actually do exist in a similar way to rational truths. Now hold on, let me explain why. A factual truth, such as in her article, she gives the example in August 1914, Germany invaded Belgium, right? That's an event. It's a factual truth. It's a thing that happened. It would be untrue to say that in August 1914, Belgium invaded Germany, right? That truth exists outside of the realm of politics. Now, here's the thing. No facts are uninterpreted. All facts have to be interpreted. That means, so facts matter, but our interpretations of those facts always come into play. So the fact is out there existing beyond the political realm. There is no power on earth, political power on earth, that can make that fact that Germany invaded Belgium in August 1914 and not the other way around. There's no political power on earth that can actually make that the other way around, right? They can make claims about it, but that doesn't make it true. It remains true even if everybody says that it's false. It would still remain true. Another example she talks about in the article. The USSR tried to wipe Leon Trotsky out of all of the official state history books, and they were the only history books were official state history books. There was like one that all students had to study, and Leon Trotsky, who had a political disagreements with Joseph Stalin as the leadership of the Bolshevik Party, and he was exiled and fled to Mexico, where he was eventually murdered in the 1940s. The Stalinist regime wanted to deny the fact of his existence. Okay, so there's an example of a fact, the existence of a man by the name of Leon Trotsky, which a political power tried to erase. And not just any political power, not just like, a small state that's not very powerful. No, like one of the most powerful states that had a totalitarian political regime at the time. So this is the most political power you can imagine, right? A totalitarian regime has control over all aspects of society. There is only one party. There is no, disputing. There's no sharing of power. There's no system of checks and balances. A totalitarian regime is totalitarian. And still, it could not erase Leon Trotsky from existence. Right? So think for a moment about what that means. That means that facts, a factual truth, such as Leon Trotsky existed, such as Germany invaded Belgium in August 1914, such as Trump lost the 2020 election, right? These are factual truths. Those remain true no matter what even the most powerful political regime says is the case. Okay? Now, Hannah Arendt goes into specifics about why that is, how factual truths depend upon other people as witnesses. There's always other people who witness such events, and that is what provides validity for them. And so she says in her article that, while facts are very vulnerable, meaning once they're gone, they cannot be replaced. At the same time that they're incredibly fragile and vulnerable like that, she says that they're also oddly stubborn and persistent because of that. We did not have to wait until, this is my point, not hers, but because she died in 1975. But let me just add that we did not have to wait until 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed in order to find out that Trotsky existed. We knew Trotsky existed. Plenty of people on the earth knew that Trotsky existed. So her point there is that, yes, while political power can try to suppress a factual truth, it ultimately will be unsuccessful. Okay? And so that is like a very hopeful thing that we should hang on to as we go through the next 4 years of a new Trump administration. And that's why I have the subtitle here of the quote, How to Keep Your Mind When It Seems Like Everyone Around You is Losing Theirs. Because it is profoundly disorienting when you live under a political regime who says obvious political truths and facts are not what they are. When you live under a political regime that says up is actually down, left is actually right, everything is the opposite of what it is, it leaves us with a profound sense of disorientation. We'll feel like we're losing our minds. So anybody who has lived under a totalitarian regime knows this feeling. And so I urge you now, to go back and read some of those authors who were living in East Germany, for example, under Pol Pot, in Pol Pot's Cambodia, in China in the 1960s during the Cultural Revolution, maybe even today. There's tons of people who exist out there who have firsthand experience of what it's like to live under a political regime who consistently tells falsehoods. Even when we know, and everybody knows, that they are lies, it's still disorienting. And Hannah Arendt has to bring yet another example. She talks about in her text, think about the existence of concentration camps in Nazi Germany. Everybody knew that they existed. It was an open secret. People lived and died and worked in those concentration camps. And yet, according to the state, they officially didn't exist. That's the kind of thing that we're talking about. We're going to see a lot of that over the next few years. And so it's going to feel very disorienting. And if you have misunderstood what your professors were trying to tell you about postmodernism, and you think that postmodernism really is about the idea that there is no objective facts, and you're not remembering that there are multiple kinds of truths, and what they were saying is that our interpretations of truths are always contextual. If you've misunderstood all of that, then you're going to feel very like the ground beneath your feet has fallen away. And that's why Hannah Arendt ends her article with, the truth exists. It is the sky that stretches above us, and it is the ground beneath our feet. It is the foundation for political life. When that goes, when we live in an era where we think that there is no such thing as objective truth, then it's profoundly disorienting. So that's why I have this subtitle here, that this is how to keep your mind when it seems like everyone around you is losing theirs. Factual truths are fragile, yet stubborn. They persist. And no matter how powerful any political regime gets, it cannot ultimately suppress factual truths forever. So if you hold on to that idea that there is such a thing as reality, there is such a thing as factual truth, and that it's not just whatever you want to make it up to be, whatever you want to believe is truth. If you can hold on to that, I think you can keep your mind you keep your head on straight over the next 4 years. And this is not just for Trump. This is for any political regime that is based on, a belief that facts do not matter. So if the left has some candidate who comes up and is saying similar things in the next few years, you can still refer back to this video and remind yourself the USSR, for example, was a sort of leftist totalitarian regime that did the same thing. So it's not like, I'm not saying that the right has an exclusive province on telling people lies about the importance of factual truth. They do not. We could totally see this happen on the left, possibly in the future. But right now, it's the right, it's Donald Trump who is trying to get us to believe that facts don't matter and that the truth is whatever we want to believe. That is not true. It has never been true, and it never will be true.